Welcome to Diplomacy and International Relations by Bastian Friborg.
Hi there. Today, we're really going to dig into some pretty challenging ideas in international political economy.
Yeah, we're looking at theories that ask some uncomfortable questions, right?
Exactly. Our mission is to explore frameworks like dependency theory and world systems analysis. These basically argue that, mainstream economics misses the point about global inequality.
It misses the structural drivers, the deep reasons for polarization.
Precisely. We're diving into the argument that these more radical views, often pushed to the margins, might actually be essential for understanding how global capitalism, really works today.
So they reject that level playing field idea.
Completely. They argue the system is built hierarchically, built on exploitation, essentially.
And that hierarchy involves specific zones, periphery.
And semi-periphery, yeah. If you've ever looked at the world and wondered why wealth seems to constantly flow from the global south to the north.
These theories say that's not an accident.
They say the system is working exactly as it's designed to.
Okay, quite a claim. Before we unpack those structures, just a quick reminder for you listening.
Oh, yes.
If you enjoy these deep dives and maybe want some extra content, you can subscribe on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. There's a small monthly fee, helps keep us going.
Links in the description.
Right. So let's get into how this whole idea of a global division of labor came about. Where did it start?
Well, the roots go back to the 1960s, dependency theory and world systems analysis, or WSA as it's often called.
WSA, right.
They emerged as a kind of intellectual backlash, a reaction against the standard development advice given to poorer countries.
The advice that basically said, just copy us, the West, and you'll catch up eventually.
Exactly. But as history showed, that just wasn't really happening for many nations.
Then neoliberalism took over in the 70s and 80s?
Yes, the rise of market fundamentalism kind of sidelined these structural critiques. But the interesting thing is,
What's that?
recent data, especially looking at the last few decades of globalization, suggest these older theories might still hold a lot of water. They still seem to explain quite a lot.
So let's talk about the core structure they propose, the core periphery model. Wallerstein's good contribution.
Emmanuel Wallerstein, yes.
Yeah.
He really systematized it. And what he stressed was, look, this isn't new. The global system has been capitalist and fundamentally unequal, he argued, since the 16th century.
Wow, okay. Since the 1500s. So you have this global division, the core countries.
Think North America, Western Europe.
What?
They focus on the high-tech, high-value stuff. Advanced manufacturing, finance services.
And the periphery.
The periphery's role is primarily to supply the core. Raw materials, agricultural goods, commodities, and crucially, cheap labor.
And there's a middle group, too, the semi-periphery.
Exactly. They're kind of caught in the middle. They might have some industry. They might exploit peripheral countries below them.
But they're also exploited by the core above them.
Yes, it's a dynamic hierarchy. Everyone's locked into this relationship.
Now, these two main theories, dependency and WSA, they sound similar, but you mentioned there's a key difference in how they analyze things.
There is, yeah, it's methodological.
Yeah.
Dependency theory, which you might associate with Gunder Frank,
Right.
it tends to focus on specific countries or regions. It asks, why is this particular country underdeveloped? What are the dynamics within it, often linked to the core?
Okay, so country-level analysis.
Mostly. Whereas WSA, Wallerstein's approach, insists the only valid unit of analysis is the entire global system, the world economy itself.
You can't understand one part without seeing the whole picture.
Exactly. WSA argues you can't grasp why a country is poor without understanding its specific function within that larger capitalist world system.
And Frank's conclusion within dependency theory was pretty provocative.
Extremely. He basically argued that development in the rich metropolis and underdevelopment in the poorer satellites aren't two separate things.
They're connected.
He said they are simultaneous processes, two sides of the same coin. The wealth of the center actively creates and maintains the poverty of the periphery through historical exploitation, starting with colonization, which rigged the game. It created this persistent exploitative relationship where capital, resources, value, it all flows one way, from satellite to metropolis.
And that prevents the periphery from developing its own strong economy.
Yes, it distorts their economies, makes them dependent, crushes diversification. Frank's stark message was almost, the more integrated you are into this global system on unequal terms, the worse off you might be.
Okay, so that historical context laid the groundwork. But for listeners today, the crucial question is, how does this exploitation actually work now in our supposedly globalized free market world?
Right. The sources we looked at identify three main mechanisms operating today. These keep that dependency relationship going.
What's the first one?
It's the continuation of what Marx called primitive accumulation.
Primitive accumulation,
Yeah.
like the enclosure movements in England, forcing people off the land.
Historically, yes, that forcible separation of people from their means of production. But today, it's modernized, often externalized. It focuses heavily on natural resources.
So it's not just history, it's still happening.
Absolutely. Think about modern land grabs for mining, for large-scale agriculture, maybe even for things like huge carbon offset projects that displace communities.
Okay.
These actions push people off their land, deepen the periphery's reliance on just extracting stuff. Resources often controlled by multinational corporations based in the core.
And a scale is massive.
Immense. The UN data mentioned in the sources is striking. Global material extraction went from about 27 billion tons in 1970 to over 92 billion tons a year by 2017.
92 billion tons. That's hard to even picture.
It's a huge increase. And much of that plunder, as these theories would frame it, happens in lower-income countries.
Okay, so that's mechanism one, ongoing primitive accumulation, especially around resources. What's number two?
Mechanism two is unequal exchange, specifically in trade and production.
Unequal exchange. This relates to wages.
Yes, the huge global difference in wages becomes a structural tool. The core argument is simple. Because wages and resource prices are kept systematically lower in the periphery.
Through various historical and political pressures.
Right. They have to export vastly more actual labor time, more resources, more materials, just to get the same amount of money back in trade compared to the core.
So they're exporting more real value than they import.
Effectively, yes. It guarantees this continuous structural drain of surplus value from south to north. And this drain, the sources argue, has actually sped up since the 1980s with neoliberal globalization.
There was a specific number mentioned, $2.2 trillion.
Yes, that's a figure calculated for 2017 alone. The claim is the global north essentially appropriated $2.2 trillion from the global south just through the mechanics of international trade that year.
That number is, well, it's shocking.
It is. And to give it some context, the researchers making this calculation pointed out that $2.2 trillion would be enough money to end extreme poverty worldwide.
How many times over?
At least 15 times over in that 1 year.
Now, hang on. If you're listening and thinking like a mainstream economist,
Which is a fair question to ask.
you might say, well, isn't that just the market at work? Differences in productivity, comparative advantage. How does this critical perspective respond to that?
The critical response is essentially that those very differences in productivity, those comparative advantages, are not natural outcomes of a neutral market.
They're manufactured.
They argue they are products of the historical power structure, created by colonialism, maintained by financial leverage, political pressure, military might sometimes. It's the hierarchy itself that creates the conditions for this unequal exchange. It's systemic, not just a market blip.
Okay. That leads us neatly to the third mechanism then.
Which is financial subordination.
Financial subordination. So moving beyond just trade in goods.
Yes. The increasing financialization of the global economy over the last few decades has made developing and emerging economies incredibly vulnerable.
Vulnerable.
To financial risks, to instability, to crises that often aren't even of their own making. They get caught in these perpetual debt traps. A key reason is they lack genuine monetary policy autonomy.
Meaning they can't really control their own interest rates or money supply effectively to manage their own economies.
Pretty much. Their economies get buffeted by financial cycles, interest rate hikes, capital flight that start in the core countries. Decisions made in Washington or London or Frankfurt have huge ripple effects.
And that reinforces their weaker position.
Absolutely. It locks them into a subordinate role in global finance, where the core controls the liquidity, sets the rules, and the periphery often ends up absorbing disproportionate amounts of the risk.
So we have resource extraction, unequal trade, and financial dominance. That paints a pretty bleak picture of structural exploitation. But why is it accepted? Why don't peripheral countries just opt out?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And that's where we need to move beyond pure economics and look at ideology, at power in a broader sense. This brings us to thinkers like Robert W. Cox and neogramscianism.
Cox, okay. He talks about world order.
Yes, Cox argues that world order isn't just about military power or economic clout. It's maintained by a combination of material capabilities, yes, but also institutions and, critically, ideas.
Ideas, like beliefs and values.
Exactly. He borrows heavily from Antonio Gramsci's concept of hegemony. For Gramsci, and Cox follows this, hegemony isn't just brute force or domination, it's more subtle. It's leadership.
Leadership. How does that work in an exploitative system?
Well, for power to be truly hegemonic, the weaker groups, the subordinate classes or countries, need to broadly accept the existing power relations as, well, maybe not good, but legitimate, or at least unavoidable. Normal.
Like there's no alternative.
Kind of. This consent is secured partly through concessions, but largely through making the dominant group's interests seem like universal interests.
Can you give an example?
Think about the idea that free trade benefits everyone, or that austerity is necessary to fix debt crises. These become the dominant common sense. Cox calls them intersubjective meanings.
So these ideas make the system seem natural, even fair.
They help to obscure the underlying power dynamics. They make that $2.2 trillion transfer seem less like exploitation and more like, well, just the outcome of global market forces, the price of playing the game.
Now, this neogramscian approach, it's often called a critical theory. But there's some debate about whether it fully meets the standards set by earlier critical theorists, like the Frankfurt School.
That's right. You have thinkers like Max Horkheimer, a key figure in the Frankfurt School, who had a very specific definition of what makes a theory truly critical.
What was his standard?
For Horkheimer, a critical theory couldn't just describe or explain society. Its explicit goal had to be to critique and ultimately transform society. To, as he famously put it, liberate human beings from the circumstances that enslave them.
So critique plus transformation. And the argument against neogramscianism is?
The critique is that by focusing so much on how hegemony is maintained, how consent is manufactured, it might underplay resistance.
It's all a marginalized fight back.
Yes. Critics argue that when the subaltern, the marginalized groups, do resist effectively, the elites often drop the pretense of consent and resort to plain old domination, coercion.
Ah, okay.
So the argument goes that maybe neo-Gramscianism, by focusing on this two-way hegemony idea, stays too centered on power maintenance and doesn't offer a clear enough path for the oppressed to actually overcome their situation. It describes the prison walls very well, perhaps, but doesn't show the way out.
Interesting distinction. Okay, let's pivot slightly. To wrap up this overview of critical IPE, there are a couple more specific angles mentioned in the sources, a historical Marxist debate, and then a really challenging ecological critique.
Right. We can briefly touch on the old debate within Marxism about imperialism. You had Lenin.
Famous view. Imperialism is the highest stage of capitalism, driven by competition between national monopolies leading to war.
Exactly. Competition between big capitalist states carving up the world. That was the dominant view for a long time.
But there's an alternative view from Kautsky.
Karl Kautsky, yeah. He was Lenin's rival on this. He floated this idea of ultra-imperialism.
Ultra-imperialism, what's that?
Kautsky imagined a future where, instead of fighting each other, the big financial capitalist powers might actually form a kind of holy alliance, a peaceful, coordinated cartel, basically, to jointly exploit the rest of the world.
Cooperating to exploit rather than competing.
Precisely. And while Lenin obviously won the political argument back then, some people look at the world today with international institutions, integrated finance.
And they see something maybe closer to Kautsky's vision.
It seems perhaps more plausible now, doesn't it? A system of collective, coordinated exploitation by a unified global core, rather than just state versus state competition.
That's a chilling thought. Okay, and the final perspective, the green theory challenge.
This one's really fascinating and maybe the most radical. It comes from thinkers like Alf Hornborg, building on world systems ideas but giving them an ecological twist. He talks about the thermodynamics of imperialism.
Thermodynamics, like physics, energy.
Yeah, exactly. Hornborg says, forget just focusing on the monetary value transfer, the $2.2 trillion. Let's look at the transfer of matter and energy.
How does that work?
He argues that global trade, fundamentally, is an unequal exchange, not just of value, but of physical stuff. Specifically, high-quality energy and ordered matter, what scientists call exergy, flows from the periphery.
Exergy.
Yeah.
Usable energy, organized matter.
Right. It flows from the periphery to the core. But what flows back? Mostly low-quality, disordered stuff. Products that represent already used-up energy and resources, plus pollution.
So the core isn't just taking wealth, it's taking physical order, vitality.
That's the argument. And market prices are the key mechanism that hides this physical reality. Prices reflect symbolic value, not the actual material cost or energy cost.
So the price tag doesn't show the true ecological footprint or the energy drain.
Not even close, according to Hornborg. The periphery exports intact. High-quality resources, forests, minerals, fertile soil, embodied in crops, but gets back manufactured goods that represent resources already consumed, energy already dissipated, often leaving the periphery ecologically depleted and disordered.
And Hornborg connects this directly to technology.
Yes, this is the really provocative part. He argues that industrial technology itself, the very complexity and power accumulated in the core, is inherently tied to this unequal ecological exchange.
Meaning advanced technology depends on draining the periphery.
That's his claim, that the order and technological sophistication of the core are quite literally built upon the disordering of the periphery through this hidden thermodynamic transfer.
Wow. Okay, that's a lot to take in.
It really reframes the whole debate.
So, bringing this all together, whether you lean towards the classic dependency theorists, or Cox's ideas about hegemony and ideas, or Hornborg's stark ecological critique.
The common thread is there.
Yes, the focus remains on these deep, structural, systemic power imbalances that consistently channel wealth, value, maybe even physical order, from the periphery to the core.
Understanding that structure is crucial, isn't it? Not just for analyzing big international conflicts or trade deals, but even for debates we have domestically about things like climate justice, foreign aid, or immigration.
It forces you to ask different questions.
Absolutely. When you consider the scale of the financial drain claimed, the debt traps, and especially Hornberg's point about the thermodynamics,
About the physical basis of industrialism.
it really suggests that the whole modern industrial system might be built on this fundamental mismatch. A gap between the real material, costs the energy, the resources, the ecological damage, and the symbolic prices we see in the market.
It certainly changes how you look at the price of, well, almost everything.
It does.
Which leads us to a final, quite provocative thought for you, our listener, to chew on. If Hornborg and others are right, if the very viability of our industrial way of life is structurally founded on this unequal material and energy exchange, can we actually achieve global equity, achieve sustainability, just by tweaking the system? You know, changing prices, adding regulations.
Or does it require something much more fundamental?
Yeah.
Perhaps abandoning the core structural imperatives of the industrial system itself?
A really profound question about the foundations of our current world order. Something to think about.
Definitely.
Well, that's all the time we have for this deep dive. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for listening.
If you found this discussion valuable or thought-provoking, please do follow the deep dive so you don't miss future discussions.
And maybe tell a friend or colleague who's interested in international relations or political economy.
Yes, and if you could take a moment to rate us 5 stars on whatever platform you use, it really helps us reach more people.
It does make a difference. And don't forget that subscription option on Spotify and Apple Podcasts for extra content. The link, as always, is in the description.
We'll be back soon with another deep dive into the forces shaping our world.